Okay, welcome to the lecture on Cuban Missile Crisis, chapter 3. Now, as usual, if you have your textbooks with you, it will be good if you turn to the last page on page 113, where it will give you the overview of what you should be expecting of the textbook, in this chapter. And the first part, right? Okay, the textbook is split into the chapter is split into three different parts, but then there will be uh, the way that they titled the three parts, okay, is quite different from the way that they titled the three parts in the last page. Okay, I'm not making any sense. Okay, it's a bit messy lah, basically the textbook. Okay, so as I'm going through the lecture today, according to these slides, right, the first portion, okay, so this is part one. The first portion will be split into two sections. Okay, however, according to the textbook on page 113, if you're looking at it now, you realize that it's split into three parts. Okay, reasons that drew American-Cuban tensions into the Cold War, and they give you three different reasons for that. Okay, so in order not to be too confused with that, let's just title this section of the lecture or of this chapter as the historical relationship between USA and Cuba. Okay, then what you need to think about is how did this historical relationship, or how did the relationship between Cuba and USA cause it to contribute to the Cold War, or how did it draw them into part of the Cold War? Okay, because I mean, frankly speaking, it's really just a regional conflict between Cuba and America. By right, it would have nothing to do with the Cold War. So how did this particular relationship actually cause it to become part of the Cold War? Actually, it is titled as you see here, how did tensions arising between Cuba and USA become part of the Cold War? So that's what you need to link it to and think about. Okay, so this is for this part of the lecture. I'm not sure if I can complete this in 15 minutes, otherwise I will have to roll over to the next one, okay? Right, so you can consider the questions: why were USA and Cuba so hostile to each other, and why did Soviet Union actually become involved in this relationship between the two countries? Okay, now first of all, okay, like I said, this will be broken up into three parts according to the lecture slides. Okay, but again, what you need to think about is the overall big picture, historical relationship between USA and Cuba, and how did this actually become part of the Cold War. Now, historically, Cuba has always been important to the USA. So if you see this cartoon here, okay, it showed how important the USA viewed the Americas, including Cuba. So this is a cartoon illustrating what is known as the Monroe Doctrine. And according to this doctrine, okay, it just says that USA has some kind of control over over this particular area, because it was during a period of time when many Europeans were actually going around colonizing the entire world, like how Britain colonized us and colonized India and where else? Malaysia and Indonesia, and sorry, not Indonesia, Myanmar. And the Dutch colonized Indonesia and the French colonized Vietnam. Okay, so in order to protect their interests, they actually somehow came up with this Monroe Doctrine that gave them the rights to interfere with any European countries that come to kacau them around this particular area. Okay, so the strategic importance has been there ever since before 1900. So it's in the 19th century. Okay, 19th century means 18 plus the year. And it is one of the Caribbean islands. According to this map, right, you can see the location of Cuba, and the rest of it is actually USA. It's not part of USA territory, but it is in close proximity with USA, so that's why it's very important to the security of USA. Just think about our position in relation to Malaysia. Okay, if anything bad were to happen, I mean, touch wood, were to happen to us, Malaysia would be equally concerned as well. If at that period of time, if we were to become communist, I think Malaysia would be extremely concerned with having a communist country at their doorstep. Okay, so same for USA. Because of its geographical location, very important. Okay, so geography actually does play an important part. We have looked at actually Korea and due to their position, actually originally they didn't seem that important until when they potentially could become communists and they could potentially influence the countries near to them. Then USA started to step in as well. All right, and they also had a lot of interest in Cuba. Okay, so why USA is important to, why Cuba is important to USA is mainly because of these two reasons. Number one, geography. Number two, money. Okay, so they want to safeguard their economic interests in Cuba, and they are mainly producing sugar and tobacco. Okay, if you watch all the Hollywood movies, you will know that Cuban cigars are very popular and something that older people enjoy. I have never tried this before, so I can't tell you how good and nice it is. And so it's primarily sugar and tobacco, and these companies were heavily invested in Cuba, and they needed needed a pro-American government to favor them. So for example, let's say if Cuba, they set the tax rate on these companies to be very low, then it would definitely favor the American companies and they will be more inclined to keep their companies there. So that's why for the American governments, okay, they would prefer it if the government in Cuba favors the Americans. So by 1926, the American companies actually own 60% of the Cuban sugar industry. But the Cubans, of course, wouldn't like this economic dominance of the USA over Cuba. What if one day they decided to look for somebody else cheaper, like China, and they moved their entire sugar industry over to China? Then Cuba will be extremely crippled because their economy will be affected in a very severe manner. These are all economics. Next time go study economics, you understand what I'm talking about then. Right? So these are the two reasons, okay, geography and money. And this contributed to the importance of Cuba to America. So how did the tensions between the two of them rise? Okay, we are looking at this four according to these slides here. American political intervention in Cuba, that's number one. The Cuban Revolution, number two. And Castro's new policies that threatened American investments in Cuba, that's number three. And lastly, Castro's friendship with Khrushchev. Okay, American political intervention in Cuba. Due to Cuba's strategic and economic importance, the USA frequently intervened in Cuban politics, and majority of the Cubans actually resented the USA for its intervention and also for installing a series of puppet presidents to guard its own interests in Cuba. So as you can see in my very cute Elmo picture to illustrate the puppet president, it just goes to show that the Cuban governments or the presidents were actually controlled by USA. And of course, as a Cuban, you would not like that because it means to say that your country has no leadership and has no say over your own future. Okay. So what happened is that they had enough of all these puppet governments and they decided to hold the revolution to overthrow all these puppet governments who are sucking up to the USA. So the last president who unfortunately suffered that was Colonel Batista. He was corrupt and dictatorial, and of course he favored the USA, and the USA would continue to, I'm sure, give him some kind of coffee money to keep him in their books and stuff like that. And so, of course, a lot of people protested and they were not happy. And one such person who protested was Fidel Castro. And on 1st of January 1959, okay, Castro established a new government in Cuba and overthrew Colonel Batista. When he first established a new government in Cuba, the reason why they held the revolution is not because they love communism. It's just simply they had enough of corruption and dictators. They just wanted to get rid of them and establish a new government. So what kind of government is going to be established, it wasn't known at that point in time. So Castro, he didn't immediately identify himself as a communist first. But then, so since he didn't say that he's a communist, so the USA say, okay, fine, you can go ahead and continue to rule this. We shall adopt a wait and see attitude and to see if you be friendly towards us. Okay. And so for Castro, once he came into power, he started to actually introduce some new policies. Okay, for many years before Castro came into power, the USA implemented this sugar quota on Cuba, which limited the amounts and price of Cuban sugar sold to USA. So basically, USA can say, all right, I'm going to buy the sugar for $1 per kg, and you can do nothing about it. They control the amounts and the price that they can buy. So in other words, Cuba was not exactly benefiting from this sugar economic dominance of the USA. But Castro, he wanted to search for new markets for Cuban sugar, and he didn't want to be too reliant on the USA's demand for sugar. And so he decided to look for Soviet Union for an agreement, and he would be exchanging Cuban sugar for Soviet oil. Okay, so like I said previously, right, if the USA decided to move all their sugar move all their sugar companies um, out of Cuba, their economy is going to be severely affected. So in this case, now that at least Soviet Union is going to buy sugar from them, they know that they won't die so badly if USA decides to completely remove all their business. Now, when this happens, again, it should be noted that Castro is not communist yet. This is a purely economic agreement. You give me money, I give you money, we are both happy. We are not talking about ideologies here. But from the USA's point of view, they would say that, hey, you are actually aligning with the communist bloc and this is not good for us. Okay. Now, other policies, the land reform law. Now, for the core history students, you will know that this is something that's very popular in communists. We studied that in Vietnam, where the communists basically just took back the land and gave it to the people. Land is very, very important, and people love land. So as long as you have land, you would be considered very rich. Just ask all your classmates with all the private property. Okay. So when they introduced this land reform law, basically it broke up the large private estates and redistribute them to the poor farmers. In other words, it's taking away land that a people so-called previously owned, and it's all given back to the normal farmers of Cuba. So for USA, they saw this as a socialist communist action by Castro. It's all economics now, something got to do with land and how communists control land, when the USA feels that actually it should be free and up to the economics to decide who owns land and so on and so forth. This part you don't have to worry about it. Okay, but the point here is that USA saw this as a communist action, and so it affected many American businesses in Cuba. Now the last thing that came was Castro's friendship with Khrushchev. So they developed a close friendship between 1959 to 1960. Khrushchev visited Castro in the, if I'm not wrong, I cannot remember the story. Visited Castro in a hotel in Brooklyn, and so and this signified the start of a friendship lah. And for the USA, they saw Castro openly associating himself with the leader of the Soviet Union, the USA's Cold War enemy, and they have every right to become very worried about this relationship. And so the tensions will continue to escalate after that because of American retaliation against Cuba. Okay, so I shall leave these until the next lecture because I have a time limit of 15 minutes. Okay, so for this section, just to recap, okay, number one, the historical importance of Cuba to USA, geography, and economics in the form of sugar and tobacco industry. And how did Cuba slowly became so-called communist is when he overthrew Batista, came to power, set about some new policies such as the land reform law, and started having an economic connection with the Soviet Union, and therefore this led to the USA being very unhappy about Castro's association with the Soviet Union. So the next one that we are going to move on to talk about is actually what were the USA's responses this so-called friendly Castro with the communists. Okay.